Okay, we're off. Quick question. Why did Watts want expression of passion? Why did he want things to be warm? And really that flows from his view of the passions and their significance in the Christian life, where he argues that we are made with passions, affections, feelings, and if we're made with them, should we not use them rightly, and would that not include feeling things towards God? Such that if he is the most awesome being ever, should we not feel awe before him? And if he's the most gracious being ever, should we not feel thankfulness towards him? And his theology of the passions says that those are things you actually feel, not just acknowledge in your head, as it were. So he is very thoughtful. He writes some works on theology of the passions. There's one called On the Love of God, the Use and Abuse of the Passions in Religion, which I think is really, really helpful. If you're interested in Watts and would like to follow it up, you could buy my PhD, but it will cost you a standard 85 quid or something stupid. But you could buy a book called Isaac Watts, His Life and Thought, and it's part biography and part thought, and it includes like a chapter on his view of the affections. It includes a chapter on his theology of praise. It's got stuff on his preaching and other things as well, but if you're interested, then you could follow that up. It's published by Christian Focus. That's the early 18th century, and Watts is doing this in the first and second decade of the 18th century. Come the 1730s and 40s, we hit the evangelical revivals. Loads of stuff going on in the revivals. Recovery of doctrine, but particularly recovery of Christian experience. People like Whitefield emphasizing you must be born again to enter the kingdom. People once asked him, Mr. Whitefield, why do you keep on saying you must be born again? And he said, because you must be born again. Makes the point. But that wasn't just a recapturing of the doctrine of regeneration. It was also a recapturing of, well, being born again changes you. Because there was a lot of very formal, staid expression of religion. A lot of this resulted in accusations of enthusiasm, because people were now being more expressive in some way. And within both Wesley and Whitefield, get my names right, there were all sorts of things like, people. Today they'd say slain in the spirit or something. People fainting, people screeching, and so on. And Wesley, in particular, thought this is all the signs of the work of the Spirit. Whitefield thought so as well, but was slightly calmer about it. But it meant they were accused as being enthusiasts. And the picture on the right is another Hogarth engraving called "Enthusiasm Delineated." Now, I'm sorry, you can't see all the detail, and you think it's one of these things where you need to know the context to understand it. But for example, the preacher, do you see to the right of the preacher is a kind of scale, like a big thermometer type thing, and it's basically how heightened the passions of the preacher are, and whether he's really cooking, And on the bottom, underneath it, is a similar scale for the passions of the congregation. And it's kind of like cool, warm, and then right at the top, it's kind of like raving mad. So you've just kind of gone berserk. And so the preacher he was getting all excited to get the congregation excited. Underneath the pulpit, you see the couple there, gazing into each other's eyes, and unfortunately, the guy is pushing something down the front of her dress. So it's got a sort of whole sexual overtone, and it's a kind of, along with this passion for God, is a kind of libertarian, just feel anything, feel love, jump into bed with somebody kind of stuff. So accusations of immorality along with all this passion. Bottom left, you see a lady who you may wonder what's going on. She is indeed giving birth to rabbits. Can you see that? Because there were lots of claims of miracles going on, including, supposedly, this lady, a lady called Mary Toft, apparently gave birth to rabbits. And this was claimed as a great act of God and a great miracle of our age and so on. It was absolute rubbish. But the revival gets caught up with this sort of stuff. Now, in terms of corporate worship, Wesley is very interesting. He is Anglican. He's an Anglican minister till his dying day, particularly in his view of the sacraments and use of the prayer book. He's quite orthodox in many ways. He is Puritan, though, in that he wants extemporary preaching and praying. He doesn't just want reading out of prayers. And there's what's now referred to as a pietist influence, particularly coming from the continent, Moravians, if you've heard of them. Very experiential emphasis. Let's sit together, let's pray together, we will meet with God, and we will feel something amongst us. Again, you could sort of hear sort of more charismatic overtones. They had things like love feasts and watch night services. And that, in a sense, is one of the new elements now, particularly connecting into the Passions. Interestingly, Watts is still alive at this point, and he says they're all going too far. He meets Whitfield and Wesley, and he tells Whitfield to calm it down, basically. Because he still thinks reason should be in play, even though he wants expression of passion. So how much passion is too much passion? Where are the limits and so on? That's the sort of issue that's getting raised in the revival. You may know in the US equivalent, this is when Jonathan Edwards is writing his piece, The Religious Affections, trying to determine what is a true work of the Spirit, as opposed to kind of just ordinary passions, people just getting excited by themselves, as it were. It's because of this sort of stuff happening in the States at a similar time. Wesley puts together a hymn book, a collection of hymns for the use of the people called Methodists. This is from the preface. That which is of infinitely more moment than the spirit of poetry is the spirit of piety, that is sort of devotion. And I trust all persons of real judgment will find this breathing through the whole collection. It is in this view chiefly that I would recommend it to every truly pious reader, and this is the key thing, as a means of raising or quickening the spirit of devotion, of confirming his faith, of enlivening his hope, and of kindling and increasing his love to God and man. That's what Wesley thinks hymns will do for you. And Watts thought so very similarly. It will raise and quicken your devotion to God. It'll confirm you in your faith, enliven your hope, kindle and increase your love. Saw poetry and music as a kind of a handmaid to devotion. That good poetry in song and good singing will enable you not just to express, but actually increase your love for God. Enliven it. And that's very interesting in terms of a theology of praise. And I think there's much to it. There's the 18th century rather. Questions there? Go for it, Richard.
Just on that one, so it's a theology of praise. Where would he have gone in the Bible? Where did he go?
Yeah. I can't tell you precisely because I haven't read Wesley on that. I think biblically you can show pretty quickly and easily that in singing there should be expression of devotion. Psalm 33, sing joyfully to the Lord. So you're not just being told to sing truth, you're being told how you should sing and what you should be expressing. At that point, with the words of that psalm, you're expressing joy. Colossians 3, you sing psalms, hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude in your heart to God. So there should be right feeling expressed in sung praise not just right expression of truth. We want it to be, we never want it to be mindless, but neither do you want it to be heartless. So I think you can quite easily say that use of music and words should allow us to express our emotion. I think more challenging is what he says there in terms of enlivening. Should it, okay, I might feel something towards God. The music lets me express it better than I could do left with prose words. So I feel great love for God and I can say that in a prayer, great. But if I can sing it, a good tune and good words, I can express it more easily. But what about enlivening it, helping me feel it more? I don't know of a verse that I could turn to say, look, that's what's happening there. But I think those sorts of verses I've just mentioned, which clearly show expression, I think we can frame an understanding of how music works, that we do feel things because of the way music works and the way lyrics work, the way singing works. It's one of the points Edwards makes in his book, The Religious Affections, that the whole point of singing is not only to express, but to enliven. So I think a kind of common grace understanding of how music works allows for that. And I think we then say, carefully framed, as I say, you agree with me if you're not, that there is a place for seeing sung praise as aiding us in feeling what we should feel. The challenge is we want to feel it because of the truth, not because of the music. And the music must remain an assistance, very helpful assistance. But we all know we can feel something singing absolute rubbish, just because it's a great tune. We don't want that in church. We want to feel things because of truth. And we want the music to aid us in that. But I can't give you a verse. Let's move on to the 19th century. And again, one of the big things going on here I want to illustrate is about culture around. In the 19th century, there's what I'm going to call the rise of respectability. It comes in a couple of different forms. We'll do one Anglican and one sort of nonconformist. Within Anglicanism, there's the rise of what's called the Oxford movement or the Tractarian movement. And I'm not going to give you a whole history of it. But it had in its beginnings, it had various political issues in terms of the way the state was governing the church. And some people were trying to defend the independence and the dignity of the church. There's a whole load of stuff going on that had nothing to do with liturgy. But it involved what we would now think of as high church. So a high view of liturgy, a recapturing of what they saw as historic practices, medieval Catholic practices. And they had a sort of a more continuous view of church history, rather than the Reformation was a break and a restarting of the true church, as it were. No, we are just one branch of the true church. There were three branches. There was the Catholic and the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and Anglican. And we are just three branches of one thing with a common root. So we can reach back in our history to these roots. And it was at this point that a lot of stuff that had been got rid of in the Reformation, even with the Elizabethan settlement, lots of medieval practices in terms of what you wore, elevation of the host and all sorts of things were reintroduced into Anglican liturgy and practice. Vestments, various other stuff. And a whole theology, I say of Lord's Supper in particular. Some people argued that 39 articles basically fitted with transubstantiation. They don't, but some people tried to argue that. That was massively influential within Anglicanism. Did you do an essay on this for Mark? I know he sets an essay on Oxford movement. No? Really different one. So, because this isn't really my area, I'm an independent, but yeah. But it was very influential. It made a lot of Anglicans, so it made low church Anglicans start to feel like, well, do we do things properly? Should we kind of wear something different, be more respectable, have more sort of gravitas and all this sort of stuff? And some of them were like, no, we shouldn't, and others were. But when you get that kind of movement that at its time was quite popular and very influential, it was called the Tractarian movement because they wrote lots of tracts. And these were circulated, everyone's reading them. So this is just going on in your church. And people are going, shouldn't we be more this? So that was very influential in Anglicanism. In nonconformity, there was also an influence. A lot of nonconformists, in the 17th, 18th century, nonconformists were basically happy to be the poor cousins to the Anglicans. For a long time they were tolerated, but they weren't equal. You couldn't hold public office, you couldn't go to university, and so on. So you knew you were a poor relation because of your convictions about church. But by the 19th century, well, you can vote, and actually a whole number of nonconformists have become quite prominent. You've got nonconformist MPs, you've got businessmen, Cadburys, Colemans, these sorts of household names, nonconformist businessmen who are now really influential. So it's like the nonconformist coming of age. So you don't want to be seen as the guys who go to, on the left, the little Methodist chapel. You'd like a building like on the right, which looks more like an Anglican church, because it's more respectable. So on the left, 18th century Methodism, on the right, 19th century Methodism. And within the services, a far greater focus on liturgy, perhaps losing some of that where it's us together, God's people gathered together, more it's a meeting, it's a formal meeting, let's do things properly and well, and so on. Within music, there was an interesting move here. The musical scene varies. A lot of Anglican churches have trained choirs and so on, not all do. Within nonconformity, some are still singing metrical psalms, some are singing Watts's type things or Wesley's hymns, some are singing unaccompanied, but many are singing to what is effectively a music group, which is on the left. They are called the West Gallery Players. A lot of churches erected what is effective, what we'd have up there. So this is facing east, isn't it? Yeah, because churches should face east, theoretically. Who knows why? So the West Gallery was often would be built so that you could put your musicians up there. And I know you can't see very well, but there's a guy in the middle singing and conducting, and then you have little groups of people. They have like violins, cellos, oboe type things. And actually there are then singers gathered around each instrument to sing different parts, which the instrument is leading them in. And so your music group would be behind you in the gallery leading the singing. But that was a very common, both in Anglican and nonconformist, that was quite common. But in the 19th century was the rise of the organ. And a lot of it had to do with respectability, where it became the cool instrument. Our church has got an organ. And that means we're really respectable. Even to the extent that people used what is pictured on the right. Know what it is? It's a turn the handle organ. It was called a dumb organ. Why would you need a dumb organ? Sorry? Because you haven't got an organist. This is singing to backing tracks, 19th century style. Turn the handle, and one of those, there'll be different things you put inside with little pins on that rotates around, plays different tunes. Well, let's sing this one, put in that one, turn the handle. A bit faster, please. It's 19th century backing tracks that sounds like an organ because you want an organ. Now, this doesn't decide anything, but I just think it's fascinating and gives a certain perspective when people argue about going from organs to music groups to say, well, you know what? There was a time when we went from music groups to organs. It doesn't answer the question, but it just gives some historical perspective. The other thing going on at this time was a move to marry tunes with hymns. So particularly in the 18th century when Watts was writing, but even later 18th century, you tended to just get hymns written to standard meter, long meter, etc. There's a whole bunch of tunes. And you could then say, well, let's sing it to this one. And the marrying of this hymn goes to this tune is a 19th century thing. And then the writing of tunes for new particular hymns, so the two are now tied together. So again, if someone says, oh, could we sing this to the original tune, please? Well, again, doesn't answer the question, but some historical perspective is, which original tune would you like? Because there wasn't one. So of course we're at liberty to write new tunes for old hymns and revitalise them as a result. There was then, with this respectability stuff going on, a reaction against it in various ways. The Brethren were formed during the 19th century, 1827. They revolutionised corporate worship in a variety of ways. Weekly breaking of bread services. So Holy Communion or Lord's Supper was celebrated, but often months and months apart within established churches. The Brethren made it the centrepiece of their weekly gathering. And they also sort of demystified it. It's not Holy Communion. It's not even Lord's Supper. It's breaking of bread. It's having a meal together and remembering together. No ordained ministry. And voluntary contributions in services. If you've been to a classic Brethren breaking of bread service, you sit around and it's like, who would like to share? And people can share a verse, pray a prayer, etc. Very different to the organised kind of meeting. And in the 19th century, very influential. And something of, a whole number of influences go into why they form, but you can see some of it's a reaction against this formal meeting, liturgy, organ, minister does everything up the front type stuff. And I think in some ways there is recapturing something really good. I think they go too far, but there are some good dynamics in there. Salvation Army with Booth, focused on the poor, so famous for his triad of soup, soap and salvation. That's what the poor need. Feed them, clean them and preach to them. Very regimented structure. You become a captain or a whatever. It's an army. But musical innovation, rather than the organ and stuff, let's have a good band. Let's play some brass. And let's take it out on the streets and play some brass. And Booth's got some great quotes on music. You must sing good tunes. Let it be a good tune to begin with. I don't care much whether you call it secular or sacred. I rather enjoy robbing the devil of his choicest tunes. And after his subjects themselves, music is about the best commodity he possesses. It's like taking the enemy's guns and turning them against him. Let us have a real tune. That is a melody with some distinct air in it that one can take hold of, which people can learn, nay, which takes hold of them and goes on humming in the mind until they have mastered it. That is a sort of tune to help you. It will preach to you and bring you believers and converts. Now, I think he might be in the last line rather overstating the power of music, but you get his point. He wants tunes that people are going to go, yes, I can sing that, and that's great. So great musical innovation, both in instrumentation and in the sorts of tunes they were singing compared to the rather staid Victorian hymn. So what's the great irony about the Salvation Army? They didn't. I wasn't thinking of that. But I mean, in terms of music and corporate worship, what's the irony today? They haven't updated. They now sing two brass bands the same sorts of tunes they were singing then. This was innovative. But the whole point about innovation is you've got to keep on doing it, not preserve. The hymns they were singing were innovative at some point, and now what Booth is saying, it's all a bit dated and dry. Let's have something new that we can sing. But 100 years later, no one wants, some people like to sing brass band music, but not lots of people are like, well, that doesn't appeal to me. So they've not continued the principle of their founder. Over the page, you also get what are called the primitive Methodists being formed. And the whole point of being a primitive Methodist is you've gone back to the to the basics because they thought Methodism had lost its way. Again, there's more expression of feeling, more fervency, both in preaching and prayer. You get some great accounts of primitive Methodist meetings in a mining village or something, and the guy at the front is praying, and people are shouting, "Amen, Amen," and he says that he makes the place of his feet glorious, and people shout out, He does it now," and it's all very fervent. And this is not respectable Methodism now, wanting a nice, Anglican-looking building and a nice prayer book service and so on. So there are reactions against, including revivalism, people like Charles Finney, Moody and Sankey. And the revivalists usually included singing. Sankey obviously was Moody's musical sidekick. And introduced a whole new genre of music. People would say, let's sing a Sankey. And to sing a Sankey was to sing a kind of that style, a kind of music hall-y style thing, because that wasn't what you sang in church. And many of them would say, well, that actually allows greater expression of passion and fervency than our hymns do. But it's usually limited to the revival meetings, or to a small group where someone would say, let's sing a Sankey around the piano. There's some 19th century, and in particular stuff on culture and how you fit in and how respectable you are. Quick questions, and then we'll finish off on the 20th. Pressing on. Right, 20th century, in the 21st. There's lots of variation on very standard themes. So in lots of the mainstream churches, there are various standard services and various manuals for worship are published, either revisions to the prayer book, or within Baptist circles you get publications that help ministers lead services. You get a whole load of new hymn books. I just listed some of the most influential and common. And this is just, it's all sort of history now because we don't use hymn books. But it's just worth being aware, when some of these are getting published, changing hymn book was huge. Because when you got a hymn book, when a church got a hymn book, that was what they were going to sing for the foreseeable future until they got a new hymn book. You didn't, back in the mid-50s or whatever, you didn't print extra things on a service sheet to sing from. You just had your hymn book. There was church splits over whether you got a new hymn book or not, and so on. Whereas today, of course, we can, either with printing technology or projection technology, we sing whatever we like. We're not tied to anything. But the hymn books were very significant. Just for sake of time, I'm going to skip a couple of bits and just jump on. Let's go to the charismatic Pentecostal changes. Some theological stuff within Pentecostalism, baptism in the Spirit, tongue speaking, gifts of the Spirit, which then flows over into the charismatic movement, not always with all of the theological content, but with some of it, but massively influential in corporate worship in both theological and stylistic issues. Usually contemporary music, so leading the charge on how contemporary music is, including instrumentation, versus what is perceived as traditional, usually organ-based. Emotion in worship and expression in worship. That I should feel something, that I can go along with a theology that I meet with God in worship. But because I do so, there's an expressiveness and an emotion to it. Involvement of the congregation in music, either through contributions, prayers, prophecies, or whatever. But in some ways, the charismatic movement began to break some of the back of the minister-only view of a corporate service. Because up to this point, the minister would usually do everything. Lead the prayers, do whatever set liturgy there is, preaching. It would usually be the only voice you heard, apart from maybe a secretary would give some notices or something like that. And of all the changes there have been, that is just huge. This is enough within your awareness to be aware of that, I'm sure. Just in the States, another big change that came was seeker-sensitive or seeker-orientated worship. Willow Creek would be the best known, Bill Hybels, where the focus of corporate worship on a Sunday morning became evangelism. Whereas up until then, it really had been a meeting for the saints, for the believers to be built up in the faith. And so it raises the question of the aim of a service. What are you trying to do? Now, that's within an American context where going to church on a Sunday is a very standard thing to do. There were some attempts in this country to change Sunday services to be completely seeker-orientated. But of course, inviting someone to church in this country, a lot of people think that's just a very odd thing to do. And they might come, but if they do come, they probably think it's going to look more traditional. And doing something, having drama and music and various other things, effectively it's an evangelistic meeting now. So that's had some influence, but not a lot over here. Last most recent thing is emerging church. Some key elements within it. The emerging church is a broad movement of things, and in some ways has died away already. It was quite big 10 years ago. Stressed informality, or at least not trying to get away from a kind of a slickness, a professionalism, again, American context, where everything's just very professional and it's a slick movement in your meetings. No, we want to be real with each other. So authenticity. I think very often had some very good things to say about community within church life. But within liturgy, ended up with some recapturing some historic practice. You can read some hilarious things in some of the emerging church literature. Let's demark a space at the front of our meeting, which is a kind of holy space. And let's have some pictures that people could meditate on, or some candles that we could light. Including, you're kind of thinking, did you not hear of the Reformation? What are we going back to here? But then with some really modern twists, because it would often get linked with, it's more left-wing policies, anti-globalization, this sort of stuff, consumerism. So no one with branded clothing can enter that area. I mean, weird. But you can kind of see what's going on. It's very funny. Over the page. Consumerism in worship. This has been bubbling for a while, but online stuff, I think, has been massive in this. Because you can now, you used to have to go and buy a CD, People would be consumerist in worship in the sense they'd go and buy a new Spring Harvest CD and listen to some of the new songs. Okay, but you'd have to go and buy the Spring Harvest songbook and then try and persuade people to sing it at your church and so on. But now you can listen to anything from anywhere in the world and usually get the music as well. Really, you know how easy that is. And I think that's both a wonderful thing and a great gift to the church, and its result, the very possibility of choice has resulted in a consumerist mindset. I can listen to what I like. I happen to like this lot, so I love listening to that. And there are some real issues there in terms of, I think, the potential for people to think of how they get what they want in sung worship kind of by themselves rather than corporately, or that corporately they can say, we should be doing this because everyone's an expert on music now because we can all listen to it. And I can even print off the lyrics and the music for you. Similarly, preaching consumerism, that you can listen to anybody, anytime, anywhere that you love. So as it were, the center of gravity of both worship and preaching need not be the local church, which is where it should be, as far as I'm concerned, such that you could even get to online church. You can find online church communities where you can tune in, stream at the right time and so on, communicate with people and so on. I'm all for online communication where that's helpful, but that's surely not the relationships we want to see in church. And I think a really interesting move then, if we jump back to the 16th and 17th century with the regulative principle and all the discussions there, people are asking, what worship is acceptable to God? What does God want in worship? What should we do for him? What's acceptable to God? I think today people ask, what worship is acceptable to me? What do I want? Is that fair? I know it's not complete, but just as a trend. I don't look at that church. I don't like that sort of thing. And we've become the consumer and the customer in corporate worship. And the first time I realised that was when I did something on the history of worship, and I did this sort of overview and sort of went, huh. And I just found that quite shocking, and showed how far we're in danger of drifting. And I think this sort of thing gives you a perspective on that. We've seen some key issues. We've seen doctrine and worship. That is how doctrine should shape it and influence it. It's the embodiment of our doctrine in lots of ways. How it should be regulated, how the word guides it, whether you're going to give people prayers they should say, or a manual, you're going to have a sort of a pattern that they can then fill in the blanks, or you're going to give them complete freedom. The place of reason and emotion, the influence of culture. You live within your culture, but how do you reflect it? How do you react against it? Which must mean we must be good readers of culture in areas like music and be able to critique it. Notice the pendulum swings, the reactions against formality and tradition, and then wanting to become more formal. And so sort of swinging back and forth. That just keeps going on, and we shouldn't be surprised then that there are little moves this way and little moves that way. It's not necessarily bad, but again, this gives us a perspective that might give us an awareness that means we are more secure. And then the rise of consumerism, where we easily put ourselves at the centre and we ask what I like and what benefits me rather than what God asks of me because I'm worshipping him. Some key things we've seen. We have got 10 minutes for some questions and or comments or whatever to chip in. And I left questions because I thought you'd have some. So. Yes, I'm not entirely sure of the question. Let me speak for a bit, and then you can tell me. We want the word to regulate what happens, and I don't think it does so in the tight way that the regulatory principle guys thought. I don't think we're given specific practices, but every doctrine we can mention has something to say about what we do when we gather together, I think. We want our worship to be Trinitarian. And so you ask, well, how is it? Do I help people see that we come to the Father through the work of the Son and the ministry of the Spirit? Which I take it would be a good Trinitarian framing. So our privilege is that we can meet with God because of what Jesus has done and because the Spirit is in us and allows us to come to him as Abba Father. Now, that'd be an example of where our doctrine is now going to shape our worship. And we're not free just to sort of address God as we like or come to him as we like. We come to him. Well, how would that get embodied in what we do, what we say, how we do it, and so on. But ditto for lots of other doctrines. So that's how I'd think of the regulatory principle working, in the sense that I'm not just free to do what I like. I want to be tethered to Scripture, and I want to ask how my systematic shapes all that happens. I then do that within a particular culture. And a lot of that will just, that'll affect, the sort of language we use, what we wear, the buildings we meet in, all sorts of things. But I want to be, suppose I'm conscious of consumerism in our culture. Well, it's not that I spend every service telling people, I introduce every song saying, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. It's not about you. But how will I both be aware of and appropriately react to that in my culture? How will that be sort of drip-fed in? We've got to be careful not to have bees in our bonnets that just appear all the time. But equivalently, I'm aware in our culture that when people listen to music in our culture, I think it's usually mindless. When people sing along to secular music, I don't think they realise what they're singing half the time, because it's about entering a kind of singing moment where I'm just enjoying it. That's part of our culture. How am I going to address that? I also know within evangelical subculture, some people are so certain about it's got to do with the truth, that I dare not worry about feeling anything as I sing. How am I going to address that? So there's some tethering and there's some awareness of my culture. Hey, leading corporate worship's really hard. It should be an incredibly thoughtful process to bring these sorts of things together. Not that you can achieve everything in every moment, of course not. Otherwise you end up with a 5-minute introduction to a song that tries to address every... No, I don't mean that. You want a lightness of touch that leads people in their engaging with God in different ways. But I want to heighten our awareness of all the dynamics that are going on. Otherwise we just think, we're just singing some songs. Yes, I do. I do think the types of gatherings we see in the New Testament and that we try and reflect today are primarily gatherings of believers for them to be built up in the faith, don't stop meeting together, meet together to encourage one another and spur one another on, Hebrews 10. There's an explicit statement about what we do when we gather, but that's believers urging each other, I think, in their relationship with the Lord and with each other to the Lord. So I encourage you in your relationship with God and so on. And we reflect that we are a body, we're a family. This is a family meeting, not just a meeting that we attend. So that's my view of what's happening in our main gatherings. But we have guests. And we don't stop being family and expressing all our normal relationships with each other and God because the guests are here. In fact, we want them to see that. I do think we should be aware they are here and we should explain what's going on so that they can understand. But if I can put it this way, we don't want to sort of turn down what's happening between us and God and each other because, visitors are here. We want full-orbed worship and building each other up and encouraging each other, but with appropriate explanation to you as to what's going on. You have a guest in your family, you don't stop being family together around the kitchen table, but you might give the appropriate explanation occasionally. We're discussing this because this happened last week, so they don't feel left out. But you don't stop being family. You don't stop being church. That would be my view.
I was just saying, related to that, what's the tension between picking songs that are close to Christ or in line with this track, and then kind of songs that are saying we praise you, or songs that are saying let all creation sing?
Yeah.
There's a kind of tension there.
I don't think there's a tension necessarily. I just think we need to formulate the connections properly. So if we look at the Psalms as a model, which I think we can do, then I think we see all of those. We see the individual. I trusted the Lord and He saved me. Praise the Lord, O my soul. Forget not His benefits. And we see corporate, and we see statement of truth to the world. Let the nations know that He's Lord, and so on. So we see both different, what I refer to as different dynamics. We do different things. We give thanks, we praise, we lament, we pray, we rejoice. We do lots of different things. It's not all People often say it's all praise or it's all worship. No, it's lots of stuff. And we do it in different directions. To each other, come, let us worship the Lord. To God, I love you, Lord, my strength. We state truth in general. Blessed is the man who So different dynamics in different directions. So there's a kind of a multi-directional and dynamical view of worship going on there, I think. And we want to reflect that. Now, even then, when we sing together, that is by default a corporate exercise. So you could sing a song that's got personal pronouns together, and you could introduce it saying, we're going to sing in Christ, my hope is found. And I trust that is true of all of us here. Let's together affirm that truth. So it's a corporate affirmation of an individual word, as it were. So there's a whole complex of things going on. And I just think we need a right balance of all of those rather than feeling there's a tension between them. It's a very interesting question, isn't it? If you read, I gave that reference from the Westminster Confession about the Sabbath day, which was the regulative principle. It goes on in later sections to describe what should happen, what should be done. And there's the public reading of Scripture and preaching. There's prayer. There's a singing of psalms. I'm trying to remember what else. So they have a little list there. But I don't think there's nothing in that list where we'd go, oh no, we don't do that. I think what happens in history is you get debates over how lots of those things happen, like the sacraments. Should you receive it kneeling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What should the priest wear? Some of the separatist groups, the whole thing becomes quite different. They spend the morning in the field by the river and have lunch together, and that would include things like church discipline, effectively discussing church life and business. What we'd probably do in a midweek members meeting or an annual general meeting or something. I don't know how we do it. Some of that happened within their Sunday service because it became a one-stop shopping church. I think probably the biggest difference would be just some of the emphasis that's put on different things. Like prayer would probably be the biggest. The pastor, the minister, would usually pray. In the 17th century and into the 18th century, pastors were often known as much for their prayers as for their preaching. So you wouldn't just say, have you heard so-and-so preach? Have you heard so-and-so pray? And the role they were seen to have in leading the people in intercession to God and in relationship with God and expressing relationship with God. We've dialed that way. They'd kind of go, well, sorry, when did the pastor pray? Now, I don't think it should be the pastor. I think there was also a pastor-centric thing going on, which I think is wrong. But there's something in there I wonder that we've lost a bit of.